breakups don't end when the papers are signed. They end when the power shifts. And in the case of Miranda Lambert and Blake Shelton, the power never shifted the way people think it did. The public saw a simple story. Two country superstars fall in love, dominate the charts, then quietly go their separate ways. Painful, sure, but respectful. Clean. Except nothing about it was clean. Because after the divorce, Blake became more visible than ever. TV shows, jokes, smiles, a brand built on being unbothered. Miranda did the opposite. She went silent. And silence in Nashville is never empty. It's loaded. Behind the scenes, people started noticing small things. A recommendation here, a songwriting connection there, a quiet show of support that didn't match expectations. At first, fans brushed it off. Industry veterans didn't. Because Miranda wasn't just supporting anyone. She was leaning towards someone who had long been considered Blake's professional rival. Not an enemy, but not a friend either. The kind of rivalry nobody talks about publicly, but everybody feels. And that's what made it unsettling. Because when you've shared a life with someone, you know their strengths, their weaknesses, and the lanes they need to control to stay on top. So when Miranda made this move, people started asking, was she choosing herself, or was she quietly choosing a side? And once you see how carefully this unfolded, it becomes impossible to believe it was random. But before I tell you who that rival was, you need to understand why this move mattered so much, and why it terrified the people watching it happen in real time. Most people think the story ended the moment the divorce papers were signed, like that was the finish line. Tears wiped away, mansions sold, two stars politely moving on. But that version only exists for the audience. Because real breakups don't end when you stop loving someone. They end when you stop watching them win. And that's the part nobody talks about. Blake Shelton didn't disappear after the split. He multiplied. More screen time, more laughs, more moments where it looked like life had handed him a reset button and he pressed it without hesitation. Every night, there he was, on TV, smiling, thriving, acting like the past was a closed chapter. And imagine what that feels like when you're the one who shared that chapter, when you helped build the brand, when you know the moves behind the curtain. That kind of pain doesn't explode, it buries itself. Miranda didn't respond the way people expected. She didn't flood the press with explanations. She didn't take obvious shots. She didn't turn her heartbreak into a public performance. She went quiet. And in an industry like Nashville, quiet is never empty. Quiet is observant. Quiet is strategic. Because while Blake was visible, Miranda became deliberate. Suddenly, she wasn't where people assumed she'd be, not in the usual circles. Not leaning on the same alliances, not playing the role of the supportive ex everyone expected her to be. Instead, small things started happening, things so subtle most fans missed them entirely. A songwriter showing up in a session that felt unexpected, a behind-the-scenes recommendation that didn't align with old loyalties, a moment of support that raised eyebrows only if you knew the history. Nothing loud, nothing headline-worthy, just enough to make the industry insiders pause. Because Nashville runs on memory. It remembers who stood where, who shared tables, who picked sides without saying a word. And after the breakup, the air changed. Invitations shifted, phone calls slowed, rooms that once felt open suddenly felt colder. When you're half of a power couple, you don't notice how much protection you're wrapped in until it disappears. And when that protection is gone, you're faced with a choice. Shrink back, play safe, stay silent and hope time does the healing, or start rebuilding on your own terms. Miranda chose the second option, but she didn't rebuild loudly, she rebuilt patiently. And that's what makes the next part of this story so unsettling, because the moves she made next weren't emotional, they were intentional. And the people she chose to engage with, They weren't random. They were positioned. And once you realize who was suddenly in her orbit, it becomes clear this wasn't just about moving on. It was about moving differently. And what happened next sent a ripple through Nashville that still hasn't settled. Once Miranda started moving differently, it didn't happen in a vacuum. Because in Nashville, every move echoes, especially when it involves people who are already standing in complicated positions. That's where things get uncomfortable. Take Gwen Stefani. She didn't walk into this story clean either. She arrived carrying her own very public split, trying to build something new while the world watched every step. So when Blake and Gwen became the new headline, the spotlight was blinding. Every appearance, every duet, every smile became proof that everything was fine. And that spotlight mattered more than people realize. Because while the cameras were glued to the new couple, something else was happening offstage. Rooms got quieter, conversations got shorter, and the tension backstage at award shows was thick enough to feel. Everyone knew the history. Nobody said it out loud. Then there's Kelly Clarkson, the friend caught in the middle, the one expected to smile, joke, and keep the peace when the cameras were rolling. Imagine standing in that space, knowing what everyone has been through, knowing who can't be in the same room too long without old wounds reopening. That's the environment these artists live in. Public warmth, private landmines. So when Miranda started making subtle shifts, industry veterans noticed immediately. Not fans, not tabloids, the people who understand how influence actually works. The whispers didn't start with accusations. They started with confusion. Why is she connected to that session? Why did that recommendation come from her camp? Why does this move quietly benefit someone who isn't supposed to be in her orbit? Because there are unspoken rules in country music. You don't cross certain lines, you don't blur certain boundaries, and you definitely don't help people who compete directly with your past. At least that's how it's supposed to work. But Miranda never built her career by following expectations. She built it by saying the quiet parts out loud and refusing to sand down her edges. And now, those edges were showing again. What made it even stranger was how calm it all felt. No drama, no confrontation, just movement. In Nashville, that's scarier than chaos. Because chaos burns hot and fast. Quiet momentum changes careers. And the more people watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't accidental. These weren't one-off moments. They were patterns. Patterns that pointed towards someone with history, someone with influence, someone whose success would naturally shift the balance of power. And once that realization set in, the tension stopped being emotional. It became strategic. Because if Miranda was quietly backing someone positioned against Blake's dominance, then this wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It was about leverage. And the scariest part? She didn't know anyone in explanation. She didn't announce it. She didn't defend it. She let the industry draw its own conclusions. And in a town built on perception, that silence spoke louder than any statement ever could. And that's when one question started circulating behind closed doors. Who exactly was benefiting from these moves? Because once you know the answer, everything else snaps into place. At first, nobody wanted to say the name out loud. Not because it was forbidden, but because once you say it, the story changes. Up until this point, it was easy to dismiss everything as coincidence, industry overlap, shared circles, normal Nashville stuff. But the more people paid attention, the harder that explanation became to believe. Because the person Miranda was being linked to wasn't just another artist. He wasn't a newcomer. He wasn't neutral. He occupied the same competitive space Blake depended on, the same charts, the same radio lanes, the same audience. And that's where the tension came from. Rumors started circulating quietly, not online, behind studio doors, in writing rooms, among people who understand how influence actually travels in this industry. Reports claimed Miranda had begun offering subtle support to someone long viewed as a professional counterweight to Blake's brand. Not an enemy, but not a friend either. The kind of rivalry no one admits exists, yet everyone feels. At first, fans didn't connect the dots, but industry insiders did. A recommendation here that benefited the other side, a producer connection that lined up a little too perfectly, a tour-related decision that raised eyebrows without raising alarms. Nothing illegal, nothing explosive, just enough to matter. And then one name started coming up more often than the rest: Eric Church. Not because of a public feud, not because of a dramatic falling out, but because of positioning. Eric had his own lane, his own sound, his own fiercely loyal fan base, and more importantly, he existed slightly outside the machine Blake thrived in. That's what made this so unsettling. If rumors were true, Miranda wasn't helping someone chase Blake's shadow. She was helping someone challenge the system itself. And support in Nashville isn't about Instagram posts. It's about access, introductions, who vouches for you when it counts. People noticed familiar names popping up in unexpected places, songwriting rooms overlapping in ways they hadn't before, quiet endorsements that didn't make headlines but absolutely carried weight. And the strangest part? Miranda never confirmed anything. She never denied it either. And in this industry, silence isn't neutral, it's intentional. If these rumors were completely false, shutting them down would have been easy. A single quote, a casual dismissal. Instead, the silence stretched. And in that silence, patterns formed. Because once you zoomed out, the moves lined up too cleanly to ignore. This didn't feel impulsive, it felt chosen. And that's when people started asking the real question. If this wasn't revenge, if this wasn't accidental, then what was it? Because helping a rival doesn't always mean you're trying to hurt someone else. Sometimes it means you're choosing yourself. And that possibility made everyone uncomfortable. Because if Miranda was willing to back someone positioned against Blake's influence, then the old rules didn't apply anymore. And what happened next proved just how powerful that decision really was.
This is where a lot of people get it wrong. They want this story to be about revenge, about bitterness, about a woman trying to get even. But revenge is loud, it's messy, it demands attention. What Miranda did, if the whispers are accurate, looked nothing like that. It was calm, calculated, almost surgical. Because revenge wants a reaction, strategy wants results. If Miranda wanted to hurt Blake, she could have done it publicly, a headline, a pointed lyric, a well-timed interview. That would have been easy. Instead, she chose something far more effective. She moved in ways that didn't require explanation. In Nashville, power doesn't come from shouting, it comes from positioning. Who gets the call? Who gets the introduction? Who gets vouched for when decisions are being made behind closed doors? And Miranda understands that system better than most. She grew up in it. She survived it. She built a career by refusing to ask permission. So when people started noticing her influence flowing in unexpected directions, it didn't feel emotional. It felt intentional. Because after the divorce, Miranda didn't just lose a partner, she lost access. Industry dinners changed, invitations shifted. The invisible shield that comes with being half of a power couple vanished overnight. And when that happens, you have two choices. You wait for the system to welcome you back, or you build leverage outside of it. Miranda chose leverage. Aligning with someone like Eric Church wasn't about tearing Blake down. It was about proving she didn't need the same machine to stay relevant. And that's what made it dangerous. Because if one artist can step outside the system and still thrive, it exposes how fragile the system really is. That kind of move doesn't just shift careers, it shifts culture. And the most unsettling part, she did it without breaking character. No public drama, no accusations, no forced narratives, just quiet consistency. The results didn't show up in headlines, they showed up in charts, in tours selling out, in influence subtly changing hands. Imagine realizing someone who knows your playbook is now helping someone else win in the same arena. No warning, no announcement, just outcomes. That kind of realization doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in. A song climbing higher than expected, a booking that didn't go your way, a call that never came. And if this was truly strategic and not emotional, it explains everything. Because the smartest moves don't look aggressive. They look professional. They look harmless until it's too late to undo them. And that's when people started realizing this wasn't about the past anymore. It was about who controlled the future. And what happened next proved just how far those quiet moves could reach.
This is the moment where the story stops being personal and starts becoming structural. Because when influence moves quietly, it doesn't just affect one person. It changes the entire room. At first, the shifts were almost invisible. Songs that felt grittier started cutting through the noise. Artists who didn't fit the clean commercial mold suddenly had space again. Radio began leaning into storytelling instead of polish. Fans noticed before the executives did. Something felt different. And while plenty of people credited that change to timing or trends, others started connecting it to who was being validated behind the scenes. Because when someone with Miranda's credibility leans in a certain direction, it sends a signal, not to the public, to the gatekeepers. It tells radio programmers what's safe to play. It tells writers which rooms matter. It tells younger artists what kind of sound will be respected, not just tolerated. And that's powerful. If the rumors were true, Miranda wasn't just supporting one artist. She was endorsing a philosophy. Grit over gloss. Substance over spectacle. Songs that bleed instead of songs that smile. That kind of endorsement threatens the machine. Because the pop country system thrives on predictability. Clean narratives, safe stars, control. But once artists realize there are other paths to success, control weakens. And suddenly, collaborations didn't feel automatic anymore. They felt intentional. People started asking different questions. Not, will this chart, but does this matter? And that's a dangerous shift. Because now the industry wasn't just divided by loyalty, it was divided by vision. One side leaned toward television-friendly mass appeal dominance. The other leaned toward authenticity, independence, and long-term credibility. And Miranda, whether deliberately or not, was standing firmly in the second lane. That forced everyone else to respond. Some followed quietly. Some hedged their bets. Some stayed exactly where they were and pretended nothing was changing. But behind the scenes, the math was different. Tours adjusted. Writers crossed lines they hadn't before. Producers started betting on voices that felt raw instead of safe. It wasn't a revolution. It was erosion. And erosion is more dangerous because you don't notice it until the foundation cracks. What made this shift even more unsettling was how clean Miranda's image remained. No scandals, no meltdowns, no mess. She didn't look like someone fighting a system. She looked like someone who'd already figured out how to win without it. And once that realization set in, the question wasn't whether the industry was changing. It was who would be left standing when it finished changing. Because when power shifts quietly, it doesn't ask for permission. It just moves. And the people who ignore it are always the ones who feel it last.
Once the shifts became noticeable, the story split in two. Not behind the scenes, but out in the open. Fans started choosing sides. Some people saw Miranda's alleged moves as empowerment, a woman refusing to stay boxed into loyalty rules written by an industry that rarely protects women after a breakup. To them, this wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Others saw it differently. Cold, calculated, unnecessary. They argued that even if nothing official was broken, lines still felt crossed. That supporting someone positioned against your ex, especially when history is that deep, wasn't neutral. It was personal. And here's the thing about perception. It doesn't care about intent. In Nashville, perception is reality. And the perception was clear. something had changed. What made it even louder was Blake's response, or lack of one. No jokes, no dismissal, no casual explanation on a late-night couch. Just distance. And that silence mattered. Because if it were nothing, it would have been easy to laugh off. A quick comment, a shrug. Instead, there was a subtle cooling, the kind that suggests awareness without confrontation. That doesn't mean there was a feud, it doesn't mean there was a phone call or a warning shot, but it does suggest recognition. And recognition changes behavior. Publicly, Blake leaned further into visibility, television, humor, the role of the guy who landed on his feet. Miranda did the opposite. She stayed grounded. She worked. She wrote. She toured. Two very different narratives unfolding at the same time. And audiences responded to that contrast. One story was loud and reassuring. The other was quiet and unresolved. History tells us people underestimate the quiet ones, because when someone chooses not to explain themselves, it forces everyone else to fill in the gaps. And those gaps grow fast. Fans debated motives, media framed theories, online conversations spiraled. Was this planned? Did it evolve naturally? Was it intentional or inevitable? No one had answers. And that uncertainty is what keeps the story alive. Because it isn't about proving who's right or wrong. It's about confronting an uncomfortable truth. That moving on doesn't always look clean. That success after separation can feel threatening even when no rules are broken. And that loyalty becomes complicated when love is no longer part of the equation. Miranda never positioned herself as the villain. She never claimed to be the victim. She just kept moving. And sometimes that's what unsettles people the most. Because when someone chooses not to explain themselves, it forces everyone else to fill in the gaps. And the next part of this story proves that the real impact wasn't emotional at all. It was artistic. And once the music changed, there was no going back.
If you want to understand what really changed, don't look at the headlines. Listen to the music. Because long before fans argued online, the sound started shifting. Lyrics got sharper, production got rougher around the edges, stories stopped playing it safe. And that didn't happen by accident. Art always reflects power. Who gets supported? Who gets space? Who gets taken seriously? As rumors swirled about Miranda's quiet influence, something else became impossible to ignore. The outsiders were winning again. Songs that didn't fit the polished pop country formula were climbing. Writers who valued storytelling over hooks were suddenly in demand. The grit came back. Some people called it the Eric Church effect. Others said it was just a natural cycle. But plenty of industry insiders whispered that Miranda's fingerprints were all over it. Not directly, not officially, but through validation. When an artist like Miranda throws weight behind authenticity, it tells the entire ecosystem something matters again. And that's dangerous to a machine built on predictability. Because you can fight PR with PR, you can fight trims with trims, but you can't fight art with strategy. You have to beat it with better art. And that's not something everyone is prepared to do. The contrast became impossible to miss. On one side, clean narratives, big TV moments, mass appeal. On the other, raw emotion, layered writing, and music that didn't ask for approval. Two philosophies, two futures, and fans felt it. They didn't just stream songs, they argued about meaning, they debated credibility. Music stopped being background noise and became conversation again. And that shift outlasts any chart position. Because charts fade, credibility doesn't. Miranda didn't just survive the breakup era, she reshaped her lane. She leaned into the parts of herself that weren't always marketable, the roughness, the honesty, the refusal to soften. And in doing so, she reminded the industry of something it often forgets, that authenticity ages better than polish, that storytelling builds loyalty, and that sometimes The quietest influences leave the deepest marks. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth. If these artistic shifts were influenced by Miranda's choices, then this wasn't about rivalry at all. It was about legacy, about deciding what kind of music deserves to last. And that decision forced everyone else to pick a direction. Because once the sound changes, there's no pretending nothing happened. And what came next made it clear this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a bigger reckoning.
When you strip away the rumors, the alliances, and the speculation, what's left is something much bigger than a breakup story. It's a lesson in how power actually works. Miranda didn't win by making noise. She didn't win by demanding attention. She didn't win by playing the victim or the villain. She won by moving with intention. And that's a hard thing for people to accept, because we're taught that strength has to be visible, that impact has to be loud, that closure comes from confrontation. But the most effective moves rarely look dramatic in the moment. They look boring, professional, easy to overlook, until the results start stacking. Miranda understood something most people learn too late, that you don't owe your past control over your future, that loyalty doesn't mean self-sacrifice, and that walking away quietly doesn't mean you walked away empty-handed. She didn't beg for a seat when the room shifted. She built her own table. And she didn't slam the door behind her. She just stopped waiting for permission to open it. That's why this story unsettles people, because it forces an uncomfortable question. If you were in her position, would you have done the same? Most of us like to believe we'd take the high road, that we'd stay neutral, that we'd never make someone uncomfortable just to protect our own growth. But real life isn't that clean. Sometimes choosing yourself looks like betrayal to people who benefited from your silence. And Miranda didn't apologize for that. She didn't explain, she didn't justify. She trusted that time would do the talking. And time did. What makes this a masterclass isn't the rivalry, it's the restraint. She made moves, not scenes. She let results speak instead of headlines. She understood that credibility compounds quietly. And that's a lesson that extends far beyond music. Because whether it's an industry, a relationship, or a chapter of your life that ends unexpectedly, the question is always the same. Do you stay where you're comfortable, or do you move where you're powerful? Miranda chose power, not the flashy kind, the lasting kind. And that choice didn't just change her career, it changed the game for everyone watching. And the final question isn't whether her moves were right or wrong, it's whether they worked. And judging by where she stands now, the answer is impossible to ignore.